One of the things that occurred to me quite some time ago is that this YouTube thing is more than just a place where I can throw up a bunch of videos and just forget about it. It's a conversation. There's a transaction that happens here. Yes, I do, of course, upload videos, but then you, the viewers, you watch them and provide feedback either directly by commenting or through analytics. By far, one of my favorite things about uploading a video has to be those comments that I do get. I do read every single one of them, and I do my best to try to reply to all of them. It may take me a while to get to them, and that's because I want to have the time to meaningfully respond, or at least while I can, until this whole channel grows up to a point where it's, unreasonable to do so. But that commentary and feedback is vital to the health of this channel. You see, I'm keenly aware that there's a pretty good mix of experience levels in the viewers of my channel. Some are just starting out, possibly experimenting with film in large formats or curious about it. And then there's others that, are seasoned veterans and know way more about photography than I do. And they've been shooting view cameras and developing their own film in their dark rooms for decades, And on that scale, of just starting versus being a seasoned veteran, I'd say that I'm probably somewhere about here, So going on about 2 years ago now, when I first pivoted my channel towards large format and film, I billed this as my journey into learning all this stuff. And that's still very true today. I certainly don't claim to be any sort of authority on any of this stuff, far from it actually. This whole chapter on the channel has always been about my experiences being out shooting, large formats and film. And then trying once in a while, whenever I can, to try to pass on some knowledge and some things I've learned along the way. The purpose of today's video is to deliver to you one of those learning moments and to tell you about an experiment I've been working on. A handful of weeks ago, I posted a video comparing 3 different black and white negative film stocks. If you haven't seen that video, I'd highly recommend that you do so that this video has more context. And I'll link to it up here in the corner in case you haven't seen it and down in the description below. But make sure you come back here to watch part 2 because there's more to the story. Now in that video, I was coming from the perspective of somebody who would rather not mess around with chemicals, and development times and, data sheets and all the things, and would rather just focus on the photography and send it to a lab for development, which has been me 100%. But a handful of people pointed out in the comments that developing time and the developer used itself have a big impact on the results. And admittedly, that's something that I left out of the video and I hadn't really considered. One comment in particular I wanted to talk about was from JF. The tell here is that gamma is low for TMax. Low gamma is always under development. The key in cross-check is you have the dark chip, but your bright chip is compressed. If it was a simple speed issue, you wouldn't have the dark chip. You need to ask your film lab what developer they use for TMax. Simply rating the film at 80, 64, or 50 won't give you the proper gamma contrast, since gamma shifts don't happen in the exposure curve, they happen in the development curve. He goes on to say a little further down, I would ask your lab if it's mechanized processing or manual, because mechanized processing doesn't account for the different development and film combinations. Ever look and wonder why a developer has different timings for different films in gamma? Black and white is always best manually processed. The differences in films and chemistry are way different and are not normalized in the same way as C41 or E6 chemistry are. I absolutely love this comment. See, this is that feedback thing I was talking about just a second ago. And I instantly recognized that I was staring face to face with a major learning opportunity here. So the lab that I typically send my film to is North Coast Photographic Services in Carlsbad, California. And they've done fantastic work for me, by the way. I highly recommend them. I'm not paid to say that whatsoever. I've just been really happy with their work. But their website states that they use Hostert dip and dunk machines. And for black and white film, they use Clayton chemistry. Now, I've never heard of Clayton, so I don't have an opinion on that. Maybe you guys can let me know what you think about it. But I did ask about their development times, specifically with TMax. And in their reply was, we follow a list of times for each film type. TMax 435mm is developed for 6.5 minutes, for example. So if I'm understanding correctly, I think what JF was trying to get at in his comment was that if the lab is using like a prefixed, normalized, standard amount of time to develop all 3 of the film rolls I sent them, then that time was probably appropriate for Delta and Acros, but likely too short for the TMax roll, which would have resulted in it coming out flat, underdeveloped. But based off what they sent me in the reply, it sounds like they are in fact adjusting, development time for each type of film. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that JF was wrong in his comment. I agree that it looks like the gamma curve is low on the TMax roll, and that I was confusing that for underexposure in my comparison video. Even if the lab is adjusting for each different kind of film and their development time, that doesn't necessarily mean that their normal development time is appropriate for the results that I'm looking for out of TMax. Now, to be honest, this whole universe of developing and darkroom technique has been something that I've purposely avoided. Now, it's not that I don't have an interest in it, quite the opposite actually. I just knew intuitively that this would turn into a massive rabbit hole. And rather than, try to drink from the fire hose that is analog photography, I thought I'd try to take, smaller bite-sized chunks and try to focus more on just getting good exposures, as opposed to trying to compound that with confusion in the darkroom, on top of it all. But it seems with that black and white comparison video, I stepped in a little bit of a hornet's nest. See, my thinking was that sending the film rolls off to the lab would be way more precise and consistent than I could possibly be at home. But it is true that each film stock has got, different development requirements. And a look at the data sheet shows that those differences aren't necessarily limited to just the development time. You have temperature, agitation method, and many other factors that I'm still learning about, and I'm certainly not going to try to cover in this video. So despite my best efforts to try to avoid taking this path, I seem to have wandered myself onto it anyway. So after reading all those comments on that last video, I figured that maybe now was the time to go ahead and crack open Pandora's box on the subject of black and white negative film developing. For a while now, many have been trying to tell me in the comments on my videos that, the best way to process black and white negative film is by hand. And I've heard you guys loud and clear. So in the background, I've picked up a Patterson tank, and I've been experimenting with developing a couple, handful of black and white negative rolls on the side. So here's my plan. I'm going to rerun this test. I'm going to use all three of the same film stocks, and I'm going to go out and shoot some new frames using all the same settings. And then I'm going to come back home, and I'm going to develop all three rolls myself, run them through my Patterson tank, using all the information that I can gather out of each film stock's data sheet. Then we'll talk about all that info, the chemicals I used, and we'll take a look at the scans to see not only how each roll compares to one another, but we'll take a look at how these test images look compared to the previous images in the other video with the rolls that were developed at the lab. Is it possible that my previous tests sold the TMax a little short and the lack of contrast was actually due to it being stunted in the development stage? In doing these film comparisons, I've been trying my best to eliminate as much variation as possible, but when it comes to black and white negative film, perhaps variation is the key. Let's go shoot some new frames and find out.
One other comment that I got in that last video that I wanted to address was that yes, I am aware that both TMax 100 and Delta 100 are panchromatic black and white negative films, whereas Fuji states that Acros 2 is an orthopanchromatic film. Basically all that means is that Acros 2 is slightly less sensitive to the red end of the spectrum, but not quite as insensitive as an orthochromatic film, which completely rejects red wavelengths. Now that will of course affect the results depending on what your subject is that you're shooting. So if you're shooting something with a lot of red tones in it, it will look slightly different than the other two panchromatic films, just by definition. But as I said in that first video, I wanted to throw in something a little different to try. And when searching for ISO 100 black and white negative films, these are the three film stocks that came up most commonly, and I was less concerned about the technical definitions between the two and more concerned with what the actual results look like. Either way, it is something you should be aware of, and I needed to make sure I addressed it in this video. So the saga continues. So I have shot all three of these rolls again, shooting mostly kind of the same similar subjects, not exactly the same photographs, because some of the stuff it was different conditions, or there was one rock wall I took a photo of last time that there was actually climbers on it, so I couldn't shoot right there. I had to go like next to it a little bit. So there's some differences in some of these compositions, but the essence of it is still there. I took another photo of my color checker card for kind of a check, and then I took a selfie, and it's a lot of the same stuff. Not exactly though. But I took all three of those film rolls and I ran them through the Patterson tank. That was a nice evening, just standing there in my kitchen watching TV as I'm doing tank conversions. Now the chemistry I used was Kodak's D76, and that's because that's what was readily available at my local store. Now I'm sure There's going to be a whole bunch of opinions on what developers I should be using for different things and stuff, and I get it. That's going to be its own video. Well, I think it'd be interesting to try to pick one film stock and shoot out, 3 different developers. So if you have any opinions on what your favorite developer is, particularly for any one of these 3 films, let me know down in the comments, and I'll pick through there and I'll find the top 3 most requested ones, and that's what we'll shoot out in a different video. We'll try different developers because that'd be interesting. But the chemicals I used, I'll put up on screen right now. It was all Kodak chemistry, so I used their D76 developer in powder form. I used their indicator stop bath, their fixer, also in powder form, and then finish it off in the final rinse with their Photo Flow 200. Now, as far as development times, all of these were pulled directly out of the data sheets for the manufacturer recommended times for ISO 100, so the standard, exposure time is what I shot it at. And for TMax 100, that was 6.5 minutes at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. All of these were at 68 degrees, actually. Delta 100 was 9 minutes, is what Ilford called for. Acros 2 was 7 1/4 minutes. And then in addition to that, there were other recommendations in the data sheets for each of these films. And if it was written in the data sheet, I tried to adhere to that as far as agitation methods and what they recommended. So for TMax 100, it says to tap the tank on a work surface to dislodge any air bubbles. Initially, do 5 to 7 inversions within 5 seconds, so really fast. And then repeat that at 30-second intervals for the remainder of the development time. For Delta 100, they said to invert the tank 4 times during the first 10 seconds of every minute. And then for Acros, Fuji says agitate developer continuously for the first minute, and then for 5 seconds every minute afterwards. Also, I should mention that I did no pre-washes on any of these, mostly because the Delta 100 explicitly says they don't recommend doing a pre-wash, so I did no pre-washes on any of these. And all the subsequent steps after development on all 3 films were the same times on everything. So 30 seconds in a stop bath, 5 minutes in the fixer under vigorous continuous agitation, and then 20 minutes in the wash before doing the final rinse with the photo flow. Then they were hung to dry. Once they were dry, I sleeved them up, cut them up, and ran them through my scanner, my Epson V850 flatbed scanner. I scan these with Epson Scan 2, and I did so at a resolution of 3200 pixels per inch. And the reason for Epson Scan 2, I've been experimenting with 3 different, all the big name scanning softwares out there. So Epson Scan, View Scan, and then Silver Fast AI. That got some thoughts on that. If you guys want to hear more about my scanning process and what I think of the softwares, let me know, and maybe I can do a video on that. As of right now, I can tell you that Epson Scan 2 doesn't run very well on Mac OS with the new M1 Mac processors. It's pretty bare bones anyway, and that's kind of one of the things I liked about it, but it really gives me a lot of communication errors and stuff with my scanner right now. So I've reached out to Epson's tech support trying to resolve that, and they haven't been very helpful so far. Despite that, I stuck with Epson Scan 2 anyway because it was fastest. I was still kind of trying out some other softwares and I didn't want to throw other variables in the mix. In Epson Scan 2, when I do a scan, you can go reset all the adjustments. Like it tries to do some auto curve and auto adjustments to create some desirable results. You can open up those advanced properties and just hit the reset button, and it outputs a very, very flat file. And that's what I was after here. So all these scans are very, very flat. There's no custom curves or adjustments on any of them. I haven't adjusted anything in Lightroom. They're exactly how they came out of my scanner. They don't look like final edits at all. And that's kind of the point, because I wanted to, I didn't even clean up dust in these. But I've loaded all those into the same Lightroom catalog as the first test in their own collections. Now we can take a look at those scans first, and then we'll compare them to the first test results. So here's my Lightroom catalog. You can see I don't have quite as many images this time because I've kind of whittled it down to just a few that were kind of more relevant. We're not going to go through it, all 12 images on all 3 rolls this time. We're just going to kind of blaze through the most relevant stuff. Right off the bat, let's take a look at my color checker. So if you still remember from the first video, some of this might look familiar and some of it might be a little surprising. So right off the bat, the delta is a lot brighter. Which kind of isn't really a surprise to me. If you look at the entire grid, you can almost pick out the delta images right away because it's about every 3rd one there's a really bright frame, and that's the delta stuff. So it doesn't surprise me because my development time was 9 minutes. The other ones were only 6.5 to 7 minutes, so it was in a developer for longer. So it's not really a big surprise to me to see that these came out much brighter than the other 2 film rolls. But more than that, If you look at these three images again, the TMax still looks flat. And that, unfortunately, is common to all of the images, just like the first test. And just like some of those comments I got on that last video, the very top row here are all the grayscale chips. So you have black all the way through various amounts of gray up to a pure white chip. And the white chip, the highlights all look compressed on the TMax, same as the first test. Now, of course, the delta looks brighter, but you still do see kind of a range of tones here. It's just that the whole thing's a little too bright, probably because it was in the developer for longer. And the Acros 2 looks about like I would expect it to. It's not near as bright as Delta, so I'm trying not to pay attention to tonal differences here. I'm trying to look at the range of tones, present in this image here, particularly on this top row of chips up here. If we look at another image, let's go back to this rock wall. Same thing, TMax on the left, Delta 100 in the middle, Acros 2 on the right. Of course, the Delta looks too bright. But what I'm kind of looking at here is the Acros looks pretty balanced. The TMax looks completely flat. Let's look at another image. You may remember this one. Same story. I'm not going to go into detail about all these because it's all just kind of getting repetitive here. But yeah, TMax just looks way too flat. Delta looks like it's too bright. Acros looks pretty balanced. And these are flat scans. So, for example, if we go in here to the developer module, we're looking at the Acros scan here. I do have auto sync enabled here. What I would normally do is go try to find a black point. In this case, it's just a border that's clipping, which is about right. Once I start getting some of the content in the image to clip, then I would back it off. And that to me sets the black point. And then similarly, if you do that with the white point, you're almost always going to get a little too much white. So I'll back this down a little bit from clipping because if you run all the way up to the clipping ceiling, it looks too bright all the time. So somewhere right about there. That looks pretty good to me. You could play around with the mid-tone contrast. You can go in here, to the tone curve and play around with where the middle tones sit if you wanted to. But once you get this looking kind of the way you want it to, this is a beautiful image to me. But if we go look at the Delta scan, now it's blown out and the TMax still looks flat. I made it a point to try to scan these in as flat as possible so that you could really see the true results of the scans based off of how the film looks. I can edit these to get them to look however I want, but what I want to know is what's the starting point look like? And to me, it just showcases more of what I'm advocating here and showing that, yes, TMax needs some help. Moving on, there was an image here looking down this road here that had some sky in it, and I wanted to see how the highlights do. It was pretty much a white blown out sky anyway, but I just wanted some highlights to try to illustrate the same phenomena we were seeing with the color chips on the color checker chart. And yeah, this seems to confirm to me what I was seeing. So Delta looks brighter, of course. Acros looks pretty balanced, and the TMax is just smashed down flat. The next frame is some aspen trees, some white trunks on darker backgrounds. More of the same, nothing new to look at here. This is starting to look more and more like the results from the first test. Yeah, the Delta looks a little brighter than Acros does on these tests, but as a whole, they both look pretty similar, and the TMax is just too flat. This one's a scene I didn't photograph the first time. I just found it on this trip, and I thought it was a really cool scene. I'm just pretty happy with it. And again, more of the same. I'm starting to sound like a broken record again. Delta looks brighter than Acros. I don't think it looks terrible. Acros looks pretty well balanced, and TMax is just a mess. And then the last couple frames are just me being goofy again. This time I didn't get quite as good a focus on my face. It was a little out of focus here. Surprisingly difficult to focus on a point where no subject is yet, but will be in the future. But this is taken in my bathroom. I'm looking into the mirror, and my walls are white. They're just white paint. I mean, I'm sure it's not clinically perfect white, but what we can get from this is that that should be a highlight. This should be pretty bright. And you look at the TMax, and that looks more like a mid-tone. But these look quite a bit different from the ones on my first tests. Let's take a look at that. So I have created another collection where I've taken a selection of the images that I developed, as well as their counterparts or nearest counterparts from the first video, and stuck them into one catalog so we can kind of compare them. So for example here, my color checker, these are the images that I developed. And if I go add in, these images that just popped in on the bottom there are the ones from the first test that the lab developed. Now, of course, all of these images were taken on a different day, possibly with slightly different metering, different settings. And of course, on this one, you can see it's a different background. The lighting's different. So there's a lot of differences here. But what I'm really interested in here is, so if I go back here and grab just the TMax images, both the one that I developed on the left here and the one from the lab on the right. If I just zoom in on this top row right up here, this very top row is the grayscale chips. You can see the blacks, you got a darker gray, and then you got a series of gray tones leading up to what's supposed to be a white chip. In both images, but I dare say even more so on the one that I developed, these top three chips, they get really lost together. Like you can hardly tell a difference between the tonal values of each one of these ones. And that's what JF was talking about in his comment, where the highlights are compressed. And that's shown here really well with these three color chips. Like I said, I do think it's harder to tell the difference on the ones I developed versus the ones from the lab. So I may have actually removed some contrast with my developing settings. And if we take a look at the delta, of course it's way brighter on the left is the one that I developed. And again, if we try to ignore just how much brighter the left is than the right, and just pay attention within each frame, what the difference in steps here is in each color chip, you can make out a difference in the delta, which means the range of highlight tones is being better represented in delta here than in the TMax previously. Again, it seems there may be just a little bit more contrast in tonal values here in the film roll that was developed by the lab, but it could also just be my exposure settings. When I was trying to take this image, I was trying to meter off of these gray chips, and I may have picked a different chip for each image. I can't remember exactly what I did. And then Acros. Still looks like the range of tones is pretty well represented here all the way up through the highlights. Just for fun, let's go compare these rock wall images. These are the ones that I developed versus the ones from the lab. And of course, this is a totally different section of the wall. Now, the point that I was kind of trying to get at with the previous frame is that I don't expect that the top row of images here would look anything like the bottom row of images. Because as I said, it was taken on a different day, most likely different exposure, different light. But what I'm interested in here is how do the three images within their own set relate to one another? So the top row of images here are wildly different from one another, but the bottom row of three images here are much closer together. Although, as I keep banging on about, the TMax in both cases looks flatter than the other two. Now the images of this dead tree, I think was probably one of the closest comparisons. Although again, different lighting conditions, but it gives you kind of an idea of the variance that I'm seeing here in the rolls that I developed on my own. And if we go look at just the TMax for that frame, you can see that the tones in the trunk here are pretty close, not exactly, but the background's much darker. And I think that's just because the light was different and it was a different time of day, so don't read into that too much. But if you look at the delta scans, quite a big difference there. The one I developed on the left and the one from the lab on the right. And then of course the Acros. And the last set to compare are these aspen trees, which aren't the same composition. The ones I developed on the top, the ones from the lab on the bottom. In this case, I think the two images on the top right, which I have delta in the middle, Acros on the right, they look closer together, but the TMax is just lagging behind really, really bad. Similarly on the ones from the lab, delta in the middle, Acros on the right, they look pretty close to one another, but TMax is just hanging out there all on its own. Now, one big piece of information to point out, as I was digging through the datasheet trying to read up on the development requirements for TMax 100, I ran across this. If normal development produces negatives that are consistently too low in contrast, increase the development time slightly, 10 to 15%. If negatives are too contrasty, decrease the development time slightly, 10 to 15%. See adjusting film contrast. And then further down in the document, you get to this down on the right-hand side, contrast adjustment, which comes up with some information and suggestions for how to adjust your development time to achieve different results. Now, of course, the purpose of this test was to develop at the standard recommended times as a baseline to see how the film looks and see if it was any different than what the lab was sending me. But at some point, I'll have to play around with these recommendations. So, what have I learned from doing this test again? Well, I think the key takeaway here is that none of this is as simple as I once thought it was. There's just too many different ways to affect, the outcome of these images. Whether it's me introducing variation or doing things differently, or the lab, or if I go from one lab to the next lab, I might get different results. There's just no simple answer here. The other thing is, it's not just as simple as following the manufacturer recommendations, because they all have vastly different recommendations for their films based off of whatever developer you're using. And it seems to me that variation in developer time is also causing me wild variation here in the film rolls I developed. So the thing is no matter whether you're going to a lab, if you're going to my lab or your lab, or if you're trying to develop this stuff at home using my time chart or something else that you found on the internet, you need to do your own tests. I still think my previous video is still valid and useful to watch. And if you're shooting those films at box speed and you're going to my lab, North Coast Photographic Services, those are the results you can expect. If you are going to a different lab, you might get slightly different results. If you are developing at home and you're using the chemistry that I used with the times that I used and the temperatures, you can expect to get the results that I got in this video. They're two totally different end results. From there, you will need to do your own tests and fine-tune your developer time, as well as whatever ISO you want to shoot your film at in order to get the right tonal curve, gamma curve that you're looking for out of your film. But in either case, what I'm seeing as a common thread on either case is that the TMax gamma curve looks flatter than the other two film stocks, regardless of whether or not my film developed it or whether I did it. Now, I'm absolutely sure that somebody out there is going to have some notebook hidden away in a shoebox somewhere that was given to them from a friend of a friend whose uncle's friend knew Ansel Adams. And they're going to have a whole different timing chart, and they're going to tell me that all of my development times are wrong and I should actually develop it at this because that's the correct value. I'm sure it is, but that's a different video. For this video, for this test, I wanted to use the standard recommended development times from the manufacturer as a baseline to see what it actually looks like. We'll play around with different development times and run another experiment in the future, I promise, because that'll be interesting, especially with TMax, because I kind of want to crack this nut and figure this out, see what settings I really want to use and how long I want to develop it for in order to get good results out of it. So I think that's it for today. I'm sorry if I left this as more of a mystery than when I started, but that's just the reality. That's how it is. It's just unfortunately not as simple as I originally had hoped it would be. And I wanted to share those results because there is more to this story than I led on with the previous video. But please, as always, leave me any comments you have below. Let me know how I can improve on this. If you have any further ideas for me and things to try. I hope it was at least informational and that you enjoyed it. If you did, you can let me know by hitting that thumbs up button down below. If you want to see more videos from me, possibly if you're interested in seeing me take this even further, see what else we can test and find out, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button down below and let me know in the comments. About the time this goes live, I should be just starting my week-long fall trip in Zion National Park, so you want to make sure you don't miss that. But thanks as always for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next video.